This week, my resource for making history bigger is Cheyney McKnight and Not Your Mama's History Site. Her current project, #Let's Talk About Slavery, is a great resource that gets into the complexity and the humanity of the whole thing. I ran across her work when looking for more sources for colonial cookery than just English cookbooks and those that copied those recipes. Her productions have allowed me to watch well-documented use of open hearth cooking and get a real sense for the amount of skill and physical labor that goes into it. She also put me onto the trail of the colonial street food that shows up in this episode. Her deep knowledge of period cookery, dress, and daily life are enlivened by her ability to tell a great story, full of true but neglected details she's brought forward from our common past. Not Your Mama's History is especially relevant to my interest because Cheyney McKnight is always showing the connections between the past and the present, but in things we often don't think about, the little stuff that is so normal we may miss it. Her ability to bring the past into the harsh light of the present recently landed her in the pages of March 2023 Vogue. Historian goals for sure. She's available to do reenactments, hearth cooking, lectures, and events, and I'm hoping to get myself in front of one of those someday, way over there on the East Coast. I'll keep trying. Links to her media and contacts are in the show notes. Episode 88, Fat and Frying in the 18th Century. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'm back to looking at fat, but this time in the 18th century. The distance from Europe, the influx of farmers, and a better understanding by the people writing opinion pieces of how much incredibly hard work goes into staying alive meant that feelings about fat had mellowed, if not utterly turned around. Fat was generally considered a good, and frying was on the rise. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know about the 18th century is that the colonies were becoming fascinated with oils from plants. The hard work of raising hogs for lard and dairy cows for butterfat was a lot. Figuring out how to grow plants that would provide fats really seemed like the way to go, but there were several obstacles in the way. I've mentioned before that in Northern Europe, home to most of the land-owning colonists in the North American British colonies, came from a world of almost exclusively animal fats. There was olive oil for the rich, but the rest of the people were getting all their fat from animal sources of one kind or another. Goose, pig, cow, and whale being the most commonly written about favorites. Spain and Portugal, on the other hand, had long been home to the rivers of gold produced by their widespread olive groves. Today, there are olive crushing establishments built on or next to the ruins of Roman Empire age olive oil factories. The olive and its oil were part of the food ecosystem that allowed the ring around the Mediterranean to keep running in the face of war, disease, and general disruption. Olive trees are tough and just keep on being olive trees in the face of human tragedy. Brined olives keep for a nice long time, and even rancid olive oil has its uses. Which meant, in the 18th century, along with their fascination with viticulture and hopes for a wine wonderland in the New World, the colonists saw olive oil as another warm weather crop they hoped to raise in their imagined tabula rasa of the colonies. So before we can get into the 18th century fat scene, let's take a look back at olives and see what we're dealing with here. Olive trees have been around for so long they even have a fossil record. Some sort of wild olives have been hanging around the area now recognized as the Mediterranean basin for at least 20 million years. But what we care about here is olives as food. It looks like wild olives were collected in the eastern Mediterranean starting around 19,000 years ago, and clear signs of cultivation are found from about 7,000 years ago, which tracks with other societal developments happening in the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent region generally. So far, so good. The rise of organized trade and written records, and the fact that olives and their products interacted with pottery containers, which are much more cooperative about hanging around than wooden ones, allows us to trace a pretty good picture of how olives and olive oil worked in societies. Oh yeah, and the fact that olive oil was ubiquitous in the agrarian societies of the Mediterranean also helps in documenting its traces. By just being everywhere, it's much easier to find. It seems that first olives were harvested for their oil because, boy oh boy, as a raw fruit, olives are bitter. Extremely bitter when immature and only slightly less bitter when ripened to a purpley black. It appears that olive oil migrated from being for ceremonial use, lighting, body care, and cosmetics into being used as a cooking oil at about the time olives started to be cultivated. Over time, as societies became more stable and toyed with fermentation and pottery arts, the practice of brining and fermenting olives grew. This is when whole olives became a table food and not just an oil source. Except for a few notable sun-dried exceptions, all the olives we eat are treated with either a brine solution or a lye solution for some period of time. After the bitterness has eased, due to the destruction of the bitter chemical oleuropein, they are subjected to fermentation, traditionally for about a year, but there are modern techniques that speed up the process. A few olive types are allowed to ripen and sun-dry on the trees, after which they are packed directly in salt and allowed to ferment. The fermentation process includes lactic acid bacteria, which causes the liquid surrounding the olives to end up acting as a natural preservative, much as in the same way sauerkraut, kimchi, and other salt-pickled vegetables work. In other words, there's no more magic here than there is in any other vegetable pickling. Just as we talk of the three sisters plus one of the Americas, squash, beans, and corn plus sunflowers, there are three pillars of Mediterranean food: the grapevine, the olive tree, and the fig. In the last 500 years or so, the people writing histories that most Americans have been reading were used to one and worked to spread that around the world, and they were more or less blind to the other. Olives were spread around the world. The Spanish and the Portuguese took them every place they went and successfully planted olives just about everywhere there was poor soil, excellent drainage, and winters that didn't have freezing. Rich, moist soil is not where the olive desires to be. It appears the Spanish recognized this because they had lived with olives all around them. But the English colonists, who mostly just dreamed of olives, were a bit fuzzy on the concept of a tree that desired to be in rocky soil with mostly dry feet. As with so many other British colonial agricultural projects, like the grapevine ventures, the people with the money to do things big, like import olive saplings, tended to be rather unclear on how to successfully cultivate olive groves. Annual crops like rice, indigo, tobacco, and cotton were run by similarly minded investment guys, but the annual nature of those crops meant return on investment was pretty quick. A grape crop needs at least 5 years to develop enough for a harvest worth the crush, and for olives, 10 years is more typical. And if there's one thing our North American colonists have shown, when it comes to agricultural investment schemes, they lacked both farming prowess and patience. The other issues making English colonial olive oil a problem were, first, what people were used to, and second, convincing people to purchase with cash what they could grow at home. The men who would invest in olive trees were thinking of the gallons of oil they could profit from if people were to buy it. But in the 18th century, most people lived and worked on farms and were extremely cash poor. While they were generally doing materially and nutritionally better than their counterparts in England, they weren't super well off in money terms. They had very little specie or coins of money on hand. There was a currency shortage in the colonies, so most commerce was done through barter. It was either a goods for goods or a labor for goods exchange. A spinster, brewer, dairymaid, grain thresher, millstone sharpener, or farrier was much more likely to be paid with cheese, ham, bacon, maybe a length of homespun fabric, cured leather, or a stone jug of distilled spirit than with cash. which led to the real question. If most people were raising their own cows, pigs, and geese, or had a neighbor who did, why in the world would they purchase olive oil with scarce cash? And any American olive oil crop would have to be for local consumption. Cod, beef, wheat, sugar, coffee, rice, indigo, and tobacco all had ready markets in Europe, but they were items that couldn't be grown in Europe or had always been imports anyway, such as cod, sugar, coffee, rice, indigo, and tobacco. Or the land arrangements in Europe meant imports grown on cheap land abroad justified the import costs, so for things like beef and wheat. But olives already grew on marginal land that couldn't usually be used for anything else, and it was a relatively low labor crop, which meant that any colonial olive oil, if it were to be profitable, would need to be sold locally, but to people who weren't keen on buying much. I mean, sure, the rich lawyers and large plantation owners had cash, but there weren't enough rich city people to support an industry at this point. And if olive oil turned out to be viable and popular, the large landowners were likely to grow their own olive groves and do their own olive crushes rather than buy someone else's oil, the same way they already did with things like cider, apple brandy, whiskey, and milled grain. There are voluminous accounts of olive cuttings and saplings being imported and planted in Virginia, in the Carolinas, in Georgia, on the coastal sea islands, but they usually suffered from overly wet weather that caused mold and other parasite infestations, or they got too cold. Even though all the colonies hosted early balmy springs and sultry, even steamy summers, they regularly experienced freezes and ice storms. And if not every year, then every other year or so. Mature olive trees can weather a short freezing snap. They have resources to rely on. But the baby olive trees, saplings, cuttings, or those grown from seed could not withstand the cold weather of the southeastern winters. So despite the thousands of olive trees planted, there are few records of successful olive harvests and crushes. As a result, olive oil remained a rare and expensive fad for the rich, just as it had back in England. But lard, well, the salt pork industry, both at home and as an export, was booming. The piggies of the 18th century were starting to be corralled into pig farms. Yes, people farther away from the cities had their own pen of pigs to deal with scraps, eat acorns, and be there for celebratory spring dinners and for filling the winter larder and such. But the concentration of pigs on pig farms or on large land holdings of plantation owners meant large volumes of lard were starting to be concentrated in places. The idea of frying sweetened dough for fancy dessert items was well known from the 17th century and even earlier. But at that point, fine flour for pastry, sugar, and pots of oil were all luxuries, even if just small ones, which made yeast-raised donuts sweetened with sugar and flavored with mace, nutmeg, and maybe a bit of cinnamon or ginger a treat. But here in the 18th century, where there were hog slaughtering events on plantations for large barbecue parties in Virginia, where there were large hog slaughtering events for the salt pork industry, and so on, also meant there were now large pots and even cauldrons and barrels of lard available. And unlike water, which when it's cooled after cooking is soon a home to gross, moldy, creepy crawlies, cooled cooking fat, that keeps. All it needs is a fairly simple skimming and maybe an occasional straining to make it reusable for a pretty long time. This amount of lard was starting to inch the pot of frying oil out of the luxury category by just being present in larger quantities. Some of the uses this savory deep frying was being put to included frying whole fish, the giblets or gizzards, hearts, and livers of fowl. There were oysters dipped in egg and flour batters, and there were different sorts of dumplings made of wheat doughs, corn mush, and savory rice mixtures. All of these were fried in a pot of what was termed boiling lard. Up north, where most people were working with smaller farms, smaller businesses, and smaller numbers of enslaved people, boiling lard was still restricted to producing the occasional donuts. Not rings yet, they were still those actual walnut-sized balls of sweetened dough, and a few other fritter-type objects. The real deep frying action was taking place in these southern colonies because the kitchens of the most socially influential houses were being run by people, usually women, who came from a tradition of frying items by fully immersing them in oil. These women were from West Africa, or the children and grandchildren of women from West Africa. The colonies had very little street food culture of their own, partly, of course, because they lacked streets, but also because they all came from cultures that lacked a snacking culture. Northern Europe, the source of nearly all the colonists who were granted citizenship, were sit-down meal societies, and the bread and stew backbone of the cuisine sort of requires a bowl and spoon. Yes, there are hand pies that would be stuffed with this or that for a meal on the go, but such things were the exception, not the norm. On the colonial streets of any largish city, it was common to see women working as street food sellers, while the legendarily spicy, organ meat-heavy pepper pot stew was popular in the chillier environs of places like Philadelphia and New York, and could be served to people in the wooden or leathered tankards many people carried with them. Something different was on the menu in the southeastern port cities like Savannah, Charleston, and the river ports of Williamsburg, Fredericksburg, and Charlottesville. Fried tidbits made of the agricultural products grown in large quantities on the large plantation farms were common, and seem to have derived from the fried street foods that abounded in the West African cities and villages these food sellers, or their ancestors, had come from. There are a few concepts that I consistently have to reacquaint myself with when looking at source material regarding food traditions that exist in tropical and subtropical regions, as opposed to my own temperate one. And a big one is leafy plants grow incredibly fast, and those leaves get used as wrapping material for everything. For steaming things, for wrapping snacks or meals for carrying away, or even as flavorful wrapping that can be eaten along with the filling. In agricultural settings in the tropics, leaves are just growing everywhere just about all the time, so it's easy and obvious to use any number of leaves as wrappers in food contexts. Being able to create handy disposable containers from a ubiquitous material means snacking on the go would be simple. And foods that are bite-sized, aren't wet and sloppy, and can be cooked quickly in a manner that uses relatively small amounts of fuel would be ideal for a street-side food vendor. Deep frying in oil is actually one of the most efficient ways of cooking since it depends on the transfer of energy through liquid rather than through the air. And we all know that while 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees C air feels quite uncomfortable, it doesn't shock the system the same way a sudden immersion in water the same temperature would. Same thing at the hot end of the scale too. Temperature changes through the transfer of energy, which requires particles getting in close proximity to each other to allow for that transfer. When waiting for air to do the job, it takes longer, because the density of those gas particles is so much lower. But oil, as a liquid, has much higher particle density and allows for a much faster transference of energy. Anyway, in the 18th century, and now, African cities are full of vendors selling fried tidbits that can be taken away and that are wrapped in leaves. Some are starch-based, many are products of plants both unavailable in the US and unknown to most Americans, and a few are insect-based. Such a frying culture was possible because crushing all manner of seeds for their oils was well-established practice all over the African continent, not just on the West Coast. While the Mediterranean ran on olive oil, different regions of Africa had gardens worth of oil-rich fruits and seeds that they used for the same purposes olive oil was used for: ceremonial, food, medical, and cosmetic purposes. Some of the best-known oils are palm fruit oil or dende, which is a vivid, rich red, bene or sesame oil, kalahari or watermelon oil, Ground nut oil, this is separate from peanuts, but also peanut oil, which was an addition to the mix by the Portuguese in the 16th century, Manchetti oil, and oil bean seeds. And you have got to see pictures of this truly dinosaur-sized seed pod. Each individual seed is about the size of an adult hand. There's a link to the photos of this bad boy in the episode notes. And that's only a small selection of the widely known oils I could easily look up. The plants that provided oil to the West Africans in the 17th and 18th centuries were so varied and localized that any sort of comprehensive list would be difficult to assemble and mind-numbing to listen to. The point of all that is that by the time the West Africans and their descendants were cooking in the British North American and Caribbean colonies, they were well versed in growing and harvesting and using plant oils through a variety of mechanical processes that were alien to Northern Europeans. It also meant they had a catalog of deep-fried foods, mainly savory, that were great for snacking and selling as street food. Now, they were able to grow and mill bene, or sesame, for use as oil and as a food enrichment, but to produce the amount needed for deep fat frying, that was beyond what enslaved people or individuals working alone would have. Which brings us back to the vats of accumulating lard alongside the growing swine industries in the colonies. The practice of frying things immersed in oil was transferred to the readily accessible lard. As a result, fried oysters, fried seasoned rice balls, called callas, and fried balls of cornmeal mush spiked with onions and herbs, that would come to be generally known as hush puppies, started showing up both at the tables of the wealthy and on streets of the bustling southern ocean and river ports. And that breakfast fish, it might end up being fried. And there's no reason a fish fry would not end up as a common meal enslaved people would make for themselves when given the chance. Fish they could catch on their own, and pork fat and cornmeal would be provided as part of their rations. And anyone who has had freshly fried fish cooked just right knows it's one of life's great simple dishes of fleeting greatness. Just isn't as good when it sits. But it was this frying practice and prowess of West African cooks that brought the art of deep fat frying savory foods to the 18th century colonial plate. Deep fat frying held other attractions. It was a great way to use heat sparingly on hot days. No need to stew food for hours over cooking fires in the sweltering summer. And it was good for cooks who only had a short amount of time to cook food for themselves and their families because someone else owned their time. By the middle and later 18th century, there was far more fat available to most people than there had ever been in the 17th. Public opinion had calmed down about the evils of fat, partly for the reasons I listed at the top. People just understood better that all this farming was incredibly hard and fat was needed. But then there's the other thing that a certain sort of person does. The sour grapes thing, making out something you can't have to be undesirable anyway. In the 17th century, the deprivation was real, so making fat and fatness a problem, and indulgence a, gasp, luxury, was one way to cope with the shortages. Making people ashamed of wanting fat made it much easier to deal with its absence. And being on the edge of malnutrition was a very real thing for many of the colonists for much of the 17th century. That level of real, persistent hunger for a few generations, especially when it comes with high mortality of children under 5, can change people's attitudes about getting to eat well. It's no longer an indulgence, it's a matter of survival. So have another challah dipped in a fatty gravy so you'll grow up big and strong to help on the farm. This reality, that enough fat to keep everyone growing stuff was going to be good for the economy, will strengthen the search for plant oil sources that work with the colonial agricultural strengths. So for the next 200 years or so, olive oil will not be it. In fact, the major sources of commodity food oils alongside the more or less homegrown pig lard, beef fat, and goose grease will be cottonseed oil and whale oil. How that all happens, we'll have to wait for the 19th century. But yeah, the Spanish did bring large-scale olive oil cultivation to Mexico, California, and even parts of Texas during the 17th and 18th centuries. But as British colonies and baby America, we're going to turn our noses up at that repeatedly because it's foreign food, especially since those suspicious Italian immigrants were fond of it. Next week, it's time to look at the last topic of the season, the housekeeping and labor issues. This also means you still have just a little more time to send in your questions before I head out on my research break. In part 1, I'll look at the labor issue inside the house and in the dooryard, hired labor in the domestic sphere. The next part or parts, we'll see how much I want to get in there, will deal with outdoor work. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles, along with cool book recommendations, and of course questions, will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Thank you to those of you who've been leaving me reviews, and while some are hard to find based on the way the whole podcast world is all fractured up, when I do run across them, they are so much fun to read. And one part of my research break will be getting those show notes up at last. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes and other ways to send me questions are also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and post.news bios at THOA Food and in the show description.